The camera panned slowly across the polished debate stage in Washington, D.C. The hall was packed. Elites, analysts, activists, and anchors leaned forward in their chairs. Lights gleamed off their glossy programs. But the audience wasn't watching the stage. They were watching two men whose countries couldn't be more different, yet whose voices, tonight, carried equal weight. J.D. Vance, U.S. Senator, straightened his tie and leaned into the microphone with that familiar calm laced with condescension. "Let me be clear," he said, pausing for effect. "Freedom isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. Something we perfected. And quite frankly, something you still don't get." There was a pause. A few polite chuckles rippled through the front rows. Traoré didn't blink. The president of Burkina Faso stood still, his hands calmly folded in front of him. He waited until the silence turned thick and uncomfortable. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "You're right about one thing, Senator. We don't get your version of freedom, because we don't buy it. You've turned it into something you package, export, and sell. And when we say no, you call it chaos." The room shifted. Phones lit up. Every reporter's fingers flew across glass screens. J.D. forced a tight smile. "Is that so? Then tell us, Ibrahim, what does your freedom look like? A man with a gun on every corner and no elections in sight?" Traoré didn't smile back. "My freedom looks like a people not chained by loans they never asked for. It looks like gold that doesn't fly first class to New York. It looks like a child eating in dory, not watching her father mine for your minerals." Gasps. Audible ones. The moderator glanced at the control booth. "Do we cut? Do we steer?" Too late. Traoré stepped forward. "The difference between us is simple, Senator. You perform liberty. We survive to build it." Now even the camera crews leaned in. J.D. Vance adjusted his notes, but he didn't need them. His next line had been prepared long before the cameras ever rolled. "Oh, we survived too, Traoré," he said, his tone sharpening. "We survived wars, depressions, tyranny. We clawed our way to greatness. And guess what? We brought others with us, Europe, Asia, even Africa. Without America's spine, the world would have collapsed by now." A slow murmur passed through the crowd. Traoré turned to the audience, not to Vance. "And what did that spine hold up?" he asked. "Bases? Embargoes? Debt? Tell me, who actually climbed, because everywhere I look, your hands are still on the ladder." Somewhere near the back, a young American student whispered, "He's not wrong." J.D. chuckled, feigning ease. "I suppose you'd rather the world be run from Ouagadougou?" A few snickers. But Traoré stepped forward. "I don't want to run your world," he said. "I want you to stop pretending you run mine." Now the audience wasn't just watching. They were recording. "Senator," Traoré continued, "you keep saying freedom is earned. But earned by whom? You enslaved millions and called it commerce. You erased leaders and called it stability. You looted wealth and called it investment. And then, you put your flag in the ground and called it peace." The moderator's fingers twitched near her earpiece. J.D. stiffened. "You're talking about history. Ancient. Long gone." Traoré raised his eyebrows. "Then explain why it still funds your banks." Silence. "You want to teach freedom, Senator?" Traoré asked, voice calm but heavy. "Start by unlearning domination." That landed like a punch in the chest. Even Fox News didn't cut to commercial. J.D. Vance leaned back, his face tightening. The room was no longer leaning toward him. He could feel it. Every camera, every eye, every phone was shifting toward Traoré, and worse, they weren't shifting back. "I get it," J.D. said, injecting a smirk into his voice. You're here to sound righteous. To play the revolutionary on stage. But when the cameras go off, what happens then? Corruption? Coups? Prison for dissenters? You call it sovereignty, we call it chaos. That word echoed. Chaos. Traoré's gaze didn't flinch. He let the insult hang, let it stain the air. Then, with unshaken calm, he said, "And what do you call Flint, Michigan?" The room froze. Or Baltimore? Traoré added. What do you call kids in cages at your southern border? What do you call opioids on your streets and billionaires flying rockets while your veterans sleep under bridges? JD blinked. You call my world chaos because it makes you feel clean, Traoré said. But your dirt just wears a suit. There was no laughter this time. Just silence thick as concrete. Traoré paced slightly. In my country, we fight openly. We bleed openly. We rebuild with what little we have. But we don't hide behind glass towers and call it virtue. JD tried to jump in. You don't have democracy. Traoré turned. Neither do your corporations. Yet they decide more than your votes ever will. The moderator didn't dare interrupt. You say I don't get freedom, Traoré said, voice low now, personal. But I get this, I get that your freedom is not designed for us to win. It's designed to keep you comfortable while we remain disposable. Phones buzzed, trending alerts exploded. Hashtag Traoré vs Vance was already #1. And Traoré hadn't even raised his voice. JD Vance's composure finally cracked. He leaned forward, his voice sharp now. You think you're the voice of justice? You lead a country that barely makes international headlines unless there's a coup. Be honest, how long will your rule even last? The crowd stirred. The jab wasn't subtle, it was a direct hit aimed at Traoré's legitimacy. JD was hoping to corner him with instability, to reduce him to a momentary symbol. But Traoré didn't flinch. He stepped forward, not to attack, but to teach. I don't measure power by how long I sit in a chair, he said. I measure it by what I leave standing when I'm gone. The audience leaned in. You built an empire, Traoré continued. And you filled it with debt, drones, and distractions. We built nothing but survival, and still, here I am, across from you. You speak of chaos, he went on. But let me ask, what happens when the empire you built no longer fears us? When the exploited learn the game and stop asking permission? JD Vance shook his head, attempting to wave it off. You're dodging. You still haven't told us what freedom means to you. Traoré looked directly into the camera. Freedom, he said slowly, is knowing no one owns your land. That no foreign general owns your army. That no foreign banker dictates your future. Freedom is standing in a room like this, and not needing to raise your voice to be heard. The crowd exploded, not just with applause, but with disbelief. He had turned JD's playground into his own podium. And Traoré, once again, hadn't shouted. JD Vance looked cornered. His notes were useless now. The narrative had shifted, and Traoré wasn't following his script. He was writing his own. JD Vance clenched his jaw, trying to recover control. You talk about freedom, he said, but let's be honest, you burned bridges with the very nations that once supported your people. You turned your back on the West. On progress. He paused, satisfied with his framing. And what did you gain? A flag raised high in a broken street? Traoré raised an eyebrow. You think we betrayed the West? He asked. Let me tell you what betrayal looks like. He stepped forward, voice sharper now. Betrayal is selling our minerals at pennies while your firms rake in billions. Betrayal is empty schools while your consultants fly in first class. Betrayal is when your soldiers call it peacekeeping while kicking down our doors. The room was silent again. You wave your flags and speak of unity. But you only offer unity beneath your boot. Someone in the audience gasped. Traoré turned to JD, calmly. You say I burned bridges. Maybe I did. But some bridges lead only to chains. JD tried to jump in again. That's rhetoric, not reality. Traoré looked around the room and said clearly, reality is this: I can walk through my country without a convoy. Can you? JD didn't respond. Traoré pressed on. You think leadership is about handshakes and deals in polished rooms. I think it's about walking with your people when there's no light, no food, no hope, just trust. The moderator interjected slightly, gentlemen, we're. But the crowd was still locked in. Traoré had seized the atmosphere like a conductor. JD sat back, blinking, grasping for a foothold. His punches weren't landing. His symbols, flags, alliances, old power, were being redefined on live television. And Traoré? He hadn't burned bridges. He'd set fire to a lie. And walked through it. The moderator, clearly uneasy, finally cut in. We need to move on to the next topic: international responsibility in global conflicts. JD Vance straightened up. He saw this as his chance to regroup. Let's talk responsibility, he said. Because the world doesn't wait for fragile leaders with wounded pride. Sometimes, force is necessary. Sometimes, intervention saves lives. His voice carried the practiced conviction of someone raised in policy rooms, not war zones. Traoré didn't flinch. You talk about intervention, he replied, as if it's medicine. But what you call a cure feels like poison when it's forced down our throats. The moderator tried again to temper the heat. Mr. Traoré, do you believe American-led efforts abroad have failed completely? No, Traoré answered. They've succeeded at what they were designed to do. Extract, destabilize, and then offer help with a price tag. JD shot forward in his seat. That's a dangerous accusation. Traoré nodded. And still not as dangerous as silence. For too long, we stayed quiet. We accepted lectures from those who'd never stepped outside their own privilege. But silence cost us blood, land, and futures. He leaned forward. You don't get to kill a man's voice, then ask why he shouts. The audience didn't clap. They just sat, some stunned, some shaken. JD looked at the moderator, almost pleading for a pivot. But Traoré wasn't done. You say you lead. But lead where? Into more debt? More dependency? He pointed gently toward the camera. Real leadership doesn't beg for applause. It doesn't come from conference halls or scripted debates. It comes from standing in the fire with your people. And in that moment, with lights bearing down and the world watching, it was clear who had just set the tone for the rest of the debate. J.D. Vance sat rigid now, jaw clenched, fingertips tapping the desk like a ticking clock. He waited for his chance to retake control, not of the debate, but of the room's temperature. Finally, he struck. You speak like you're free, he said coldly. But if you were, you wouldn't need to be on this stage, pleading your case to the very people you claim to resist. Traoré turned slowly toward him, that familiar half-smile flickering, not of amusement, but of recognition. I'm not here to plead, he said, voice steady. I'm here to remind. JD waved a dismissive hand. You keep talking about oppression like it's the air you breathe. But you fly on American planes. You debate on American networks. You wear suits stitched in nations you criticize. Exactly, Traoré replied. You don't see the irony. You export your idea of freedom, but only after branding it. He paused, locking eyes with Vance. You said, you don't get freedom. But I do. Just not the version you sell. A ripple ran through the studio. Your freedom, Traoré continued, has a barcode. It's negotiated in backrooms. It's free. As long as we behave. He leaned forward, voice dropping but rising in force. My people's freedom doesn't come with strings. It doesn't bow to lenders, or pipelines, or signatures. It walks barefoot, if it must. But it walks forward. JD opened his mouth, but couldn't find a retort that didn't sound manufactured. His silence felt louder than any applause. Then Traoré delivered the blow. You don't understand us. Because you were raised to win. We were raised to survive. And surviving teaches you truths that comfort never will. The moderator sat frozen. The audience, locked in. And the story, far from over. A silence stretched in the room, not the awkward kind, but the kind that follows a truth too raw to debate. J.D. Vance adjusted his tie, leaned back, and forced a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. So now you're the symbol of survival? He asked, voice laced with sarcasm. What next? You'll tell us you're the voice of the voiceless? No, Traoré said without missing a beat. I'm just the echo they couldn't silence. The line hit harder than it should have. JD turned away for a second, glancing at the producers behind the glass, hoping someone would interrupt. No one did. Traoré continued, his voice calmer now, but the edge remained. You think survival is passive. You think it's weakness wrapped in desperation. But I'll tell you what survival is, it's a mother boiling leaves just to give her children something warm in their stomachs. It's a village sharing a single textbook, still teaching freedom. It's a nation with no allies standing its ground while the world looks away. And yet, JD cut in, you're still here, wearing that expensive watch, speaking fluent English, enjoying every liberty this country offers. Traoré raised his wrist and slowly removed the watch. He placed it on the table like evidence. This, he said. This doesn't define me. My people do. Their struggle built the spine I walk with. Their pain sharpened the words I speak. He paused. You confuse comfort with credibility, JD. But I've lived both hunger and hope. I've knelt in the mud and stood before kings. And I chose truth over applause every time. The audience erupted in quiet applause, not loud, not showy. But real. Measured. Respectful. And for the first time, J.D. Vance had nothing clever to say. He just sat there, watching a man he thought he could humiliate walk taller, without ever leaving his seat. The moderator's voice cracked faintly as she tried to regain control. Let's move to closing statements, gentlemen. But J.D. Vance leaned in, ignoring her cue. You came to our country to talk about your freedom, he said sharply. You insult our system, our values, on our stage. But let me remind you, this platform, this visibility, it exists because we built it. Without us, you'd still be shouting into the desert. The words hung in the air like smoke from a cheap firework. Loud, but destined to vanish. Traoré blinked slowly. Do you hear yourself? He asked quietly. You think this stage is yours because you wired the lights. But the light doesn't belong to the builder, it belongs to truth. He stood. And for the first time all night, J.D. Vance looked small. This stage isn't yours, J.D. It never was. It belongs to the people who dare to speak when it's dangerous. Who stand even when told to kneel. Who confront power, not because they hate it, but because they refuse to be owned by it. He turned to the audience. I didn't come here to beg. I came here to expose what's been dressed as justice but smells of control. You say I'm free to speak? Then why do your allies spend billions making sure no one hears me? The applause now grew, not thunderous, but steady. Like rain tapping the roof before a storm. And by the way, Traoré added, glancing back at Vance, deserts echo longer than cities. Be careful what you shout into them. J.D. Vance didn't stand. He just sat there, breathing hard. The show wasn't over. But the moment was no longer his. The broadcast ended, but the room didn't exhale. Producers whispered frantically through headsets, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the silence play. J.D. Vance gathered his notes, but the pages in his hands trembled. The script hadn't just gone off track, it had been rewritten, live, and he'd become the background character in a story he thought he was authoring. Traoré didn't move. He stood there, still. Not to gloat. Not to perform. But to allow the weight of what just happened to settle into the walls. No hashtags. No victory lap. Just presence. A young intern at the back of the studio dropped her clipboard, nerves, or maybe awe. She mouthed to a colleague, "Who is this guy?" Outside, social media caught fire. Clips of Traoré's words, "Deserts echo longer than cities," were already trending. Memes exploded. Hashtags like #StageStolen and #TruthOverPower surged in minutes. Some called him arrogant. Others called him revolutionary. But the one word that kept surfacing, even from the critics? Unshakable. In the green room, a Republican strategist muttered under his breath, "We should have never let them share the stage." Meanwhile, Traoré finally stepped away from the podium. As he passed J.D. Vance, he offered no smirk, no nod, just a final word. "You invited me here to lose. I came here to remind you, my people don't play by your rules anymore." Then he walked out, not chased by cameras, but followed by silence. The kind of silence that doesn't forget. They thought they were inviting a guest. He became the voice they couldn't silence. J.D. Vance wanted a stage to prove dominance. But Traoré turned it into a lesson on power, history, and dignity. This wasn't just a clash of words. It was a collision of worlds. One built on image, the other on purpose. And while one man stumbled through applause, the other stood tall in the echo of truth. Freedom isn't handed out on cue cards. It's earned, by those who never asked permission to lead.